thank you very much to everyone involved in organizing this conference. It is the third year that I'm participating, and I'm very honored and proud to be part of this very important and useful conference. My presentation today is titled Climate Justice, and I'm going to look at the anthropocentrism versus the ecocentrism of law. I have been working on climate justice research for the last decade, and I'm sorry that I have to report that very little progress has been made in implementing policies, rules, and laws to progress and implement climate justice. So, for example, if you have witnessed the international community's steps have been hectic, and politicians, they keep on holding conferences, climate summits to discuss things, ideas, facts that they are known to us for the last 2, maybe 3, if not 4 or 5 decades. Okay, we know about the dangers and the risks of the climate change since the 1960s. Now it's 2021, and we are under a climate emergency, and we still keep on discussing the same issues. I'm very sorry that I have to report on that. That being said, me as a climate justice specialist, I'm trying to promote these ideas of climate justice. I know previously there was a participant that he was commenting about the different terms and the different kinds of justice that we are talking about, but it is important to specify what we are talking about. It's important to promote the specific field of climate justice in order to move and to promote faster and more effective action in tackling the anthropogenic harms that fuel climate change and that they have resulted in the climate emergency that we are currently going through. Okay, this is a climate crisis. We are under a climate emergency, and climate justice is advocating for promoting this, for promoting climate action and for pushing for positive social change in the political and the legal areas. So after a decade working on climate justice, I have identified that the anthropocentrism of law is what is the greatest obstacle in moving real action for protecting the environment. So the fact that we are putting all the value, that we are viewing law as being human-centered, I will explain later on in my presentation what anthropocentrism means and what ecocentrism means, in order to help you understand what is the conflict here. I'm using human rights, law, and philosophy in my scholarship. And this is the theoretical background, let's say, of this area. And it's important to define, to explain, and to classify what are we talking about. I like to start my presentations with this image. I hope you can all see it. It is a sculpture. It's a piece of art, and is titled "Politicians Debating Global Warming." So this is the best representation of the climate inaction that is on the hands of politicians. Okay, so there you go. Now, climate justice. What is it? Meaning, definition, explanation. In my paper, because this presentation is part of a paper that I'm working on as part of my scholarship, I am examining the conflicting ideas of ecocentrism and anthropocentrism of law by looking at the environmental law through the philosophical lens of climate justice. Okay, anthropocentrism, as I said earlier, is essentially human-centric. It puts all the value on the humans, while ecocentrism is nature-centric. Okay, let me just explain that our whole international legal system is anthropocentric. This is how we understand international law. This is how we apply, this is how we create it. If there is value for humans, then there is a place for it in the international legal order. And of course, for example, look at the human rights legal system, which is intrinsically human-centered, right? Like it's anthropocentric, and it makes sense to have anthropocentrism in human rights. However, climate justice comes into the play, and we are advocating for a more progressive ideas into our legal systems, and this is where ecocentrism comes into play. So, why is it that the international law is failing to acknowledge that there is a great need for including ecocentrism in its workings? As it is argued by activists and scholars, in the root of our climate emergency lies this outdated idea of anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism places the anthropos in Greek means human. So we are looking at the anthropos in the center of law, and as such is regarding humankind as the central or most important element of existence, especially when opposed to nature or animals, okay? So in my scholarship, I'm asking questions in order to find the truth of why is it that it's 2021 and we are under a climate emergency and we're still unable as international lawyers to push for positive change, why we're still continuing business as usual under this economic system, and we keep on exploiting nature, we keep on harming nature. There is harm that can be identified under law. So there is anthropogenic harm that you can identify who is responsible for this harm. Who is responsible for this anthropogenic harm that is fueling climate change and eventually is responsible for the climate emergency that we are currently under? So this is what we are looking at. This is what we are trying to clarify. This is why we are asking these questions. It sounds theoretical, but it has practical application eventually. So for example, I'm asking questions like, can climate justice overcome the obstacles anthropocentrism creates in blocking real legal action? Because after a decade engaging with this research field, I have identified that anthropocentrism is the greatest obstacle in evolving in our international legal system. Now I'm asking questions like, has anthropocentrism failed to move positive climate action? And I'm sorry to report that it has. Can ecocentrism overcome the empty political promises and move political legal action? I'm also asking, can these two legal approaches, these two philosophical schools of thought, let's say, coexist for the betterment of law, for the evolvement of law, and for ensuring, at the end of the day, a sustainable future for humankind, for ensuring human rights and the rights of future generations? In the international legal world, we keep on trying to find justifications in order to make our arguments stronger, in order to convince politicians to actually take action. And at the end of the day, is the future of international law green? So there you go. At the end of the day, anthropocentrism is said to agree with ecocentrism view that there is value on nature, because at the end of the day, there is material or physical benefits that it can provide for humans. So even if there are theorists that advocate for anthropocentrism, there is this ecocentric argument that says, you know what, it's actually good for humans to protect the environment because there's value in protecting nature, because that's how humans can live a good life. So there you go. Finally, I'm examining the reasons that the climate emergency is not being treated as an emergency, and to assess the reasons behind the softness of environmental law, even in 2021, and the connection of these ideas with ensuring climate justice and the prosecution of green crimes. So climate justice, what is climate justice? It can be understood as a lens for looking at climate change as a social, ethical, and legal issue, rather than solely an environmental one. I have recently written a policy brief for the Global Campus of Human Rights, And here in the chat, I'm going to share a link where you can all have access to this policy brief. And it's advocating for climate justice. It explains the linkages between climate change and human rights. And I propose some policy ideas for promoting climate justice and tackling eventually the climate emergency. So this frame of justice has in its core the protection of human rights and of the most vulnerable in a climate changed world. Climate justice is mirroring the rule of law and is developed on a rights-based approach. It's very important. So it is a matter of global justice, but with duties spreading from the international to the regional and national stakeholders. Climate change is undermining the fulfillment of a number of human rights, of internationally protected human rights, like the rights to health, to life, the rights to food, water, shelter, and property, rights associated with livelihood and culture, with migration and resettlement. The list goes on. It's not exhaustive, but let me just tell you that in a climate change world, no human rights can be basically enjoyed. In a destroyed environment, there is no possibility for enjoying human rights. So in my view, a climate change world under this climate emergency is the ultimate violator of human rights. So listing 10 or 5 or 15 human rights that will be negatively affected by climate change is in vain, because at the end of the day, is the ultimate violator of human rights. So the main message of my scholarship is intended to raise awareness about the climate emergency that our world is under, and to extend an urgent call for immediate climate action addressed to all stakeholders, from the European to the UN, including politicians, law and policymakers, as well as civil society. Because after 3 decades of negotiating about the reach and power of climate laws and policies, we have reached a point that the negative effects of climate change are directly harming today human rights on a large scale. It's not a matter of, talking about the future, what disasters will happen in the future. It's happening right now. So climate change has become synonymous for climate emergency. And if this emergency is not mitigated by climate justice, it will turn into the end of human rights. And it is not rocket science to understand that in a world without a healthy environment, as I said before, drinkable water and clean oxygen, no right to life or any human right for that matter can be truly enjoyed. So in my view, the future of climate justice depends on the inclusion of human rights, green crimes, animal rights, and the rights of nature on the table of negotiations. And this is where ecocentrism comes into play. So this will require a shift from the outdated anthropocentric function of law and a positive move towards an ecocentric understanding of climate justice. So let me go to the next slide. I have here a slide with information about environmental refugees, which is part of the climate justice field. And you can see, for example, that between 2008 and 2012, 144 million people were displaced by sudden onset disasters. So this is just an indication of how large-scale the climate emergency is. Now we're 2021, as I said. So I have a slide here where you can see some human rights that are affected by climate change in order to prove my point and to explain how there is connection between climate change and the enjoyment of human rights. This comes from Amnesty International, and they have chosen to use the right to life, which is the first human right, let's say, one of the most important human rights, and the right to food, right to adequate housing, right to water, sanitation, and health. But as I told you, this is just an indication in order to explain what is at stake. As I told you, we're talking about the ultimate violator of human rights. 10 years ago, talking about this connection of climate change with human rights was met with walls, was met by a climate denial machine saying that there is no connection from climate change with human rights, and that it's just like a hoax, that there is today, after years and years of advocacy, publications, research, we know and we have proven, and it has been accepted by the international community, by the orthodox, let's say, academia and legal practitioners, that there is a strong connection of climate change with human rights, and we need to mitigate these dangers. Now, the future of climate justice depends on the inclusion of human rights. I'm adding green crimes, animal rights, and the rights of nature on the table of negotiations. And this will require a shift from the outdated anthropocentric function of law and a positive move towards an ecocentric understanding of climate justice. This summarizes my presentation. Basically, this is why I'm repeating this information. Anthropocentrism, what is it? So I'm having this etymological explanation just to explain deeply what are we talking about, because in philosophy, as well in law, we care about specifying what is it that we talk about. So even if you think that is in vain talking about terms, it's very important to basically explain them and clarify them in order to make sure that they will not be counter, let's say, acted in the future by other arguments. So etymologically, anthropocentrism is made by two words. It's a synthetic term, by anthropo and centrism. Anthropo in Greek, in ancient Greek, means human, the human being. And centrism, as you can imagine, it means the center. Again, in ancient Greek. Let me just say, in modern Greek as well, because I'm Greek and I'm using this language in my everyday life. So in ancient and modern Greek, this is what it means. The human in the center. This is where we see the value. This is where we see the intrinsic important value and what do we care about in anthropocentrism. It has its roots in ancient philosophy. It's as old as literature itself. And for example, you can see here Protagoras saying that man is the measure of all things. Of all things, the measure is man. Of the things that are, that or how they are, and of things that are not. So the man is the measure of all things, and this is under our skin. This is how we understand philosophy today as well. So the belief that man can conquer nature spreads throughout philosophy, literature, religion, culture, and society. It's very deeply ingrained in our understanding of what is right, of what is moral, of what is important, of where is value. And it translates in seeing where is value in law as well. Okay, we're talking about common sense, for example. We're talking about the reasonable man test. We take this as common sense because it's so deeply ingrained in our understanding of what is right or wrong, because you can find it even in all this, literature. In Descartes, for example, theory of animal are machines. In Protagoras' claim of man is the measure of all things. In Kant's lectures on ethics, and the list goes on. So Descartes, for example, in Animal Are Machines, explains that humans have the ability to think and communicate in some form of language. However, animals are not able to. So he thought that this distinguishes mankind from animals, and this idea becomes the main subjectivity of Western thought. We need to deconstruct all that and move forward. But just explaining how we came to take that for granted. At the end of Animal Are Machines, he concludes, for example, he says, and though they may lack tongue and organs of voice, referring to animals, but no animals do, consequently, it can be taken as a real specific difference between men and dumb animals. So there you go. This is anthropocentrism for you. Now, another example of anthropocentrism, in order to grasp what is it that we're talking about, is can be found in Immanuel Kant, that he believed that animals have no moral rights, since he thought that only rational creatures, human, referring to human, have the rights to be concerned. In his lectures on ethics, he indicates that the only thing with an intrinsic value is a goodwill. Since animals have no wills at all, that's what he believed, they cannot have good wills. So therefore, they do not have any intrinsic value. So protecting nature, protecting animals, protecting ecological, the ecosystem, it meets all these obstacles by anthropocentric understanding of where is the value of what is important. Okay, so Kant also explains, Kant is one of the greatest philosophers, in case you haven't heard him before. He explains that the duties of man toward to animals, and he states, animals are not self-conscious and are there merely as a means to an end, and that end is man. So therefore, he concludes, we see that all duties towards animals and towards immaterial beings and towards inanimate objects are aimed indirectly at our duties towards mankind. So this is anthropocentrism for you. Now, very quickly to go to ecocentrism, to understand where is the difference between the anthropocentrism and ecocentrism. In the philosophy of ecocentrism, or perspective that places intrinsic value on non-living organisms, okay, ecocentrism places intrinsic value on all living organisms and their natural environment, regardless of their perceived usefulness or importance to human beings. This is ecocentrism. Ecocentrism is an advocate to giving moral status to the whole ecosystem. And in my view, even a non-legally trained, let's say, mind can agree that the fairer of the two systems of between anthropocentrism and ecocentrism is ecocentrism. The most fair, thank you for your message. So I have 10 minutes left. There you go. I'll just go very quickly. I just want to mention Aldo Leopold because he coined the term ecocentrism, and out of respect, I need to mention him. And he basically believed that humans should expand their community, including soil, water, plants, and animal, basically the entire Earth's living and non-living organisms. Human is just part of this community. So we must respect other organisms that are living with us. Everything has the right to survive, according to Leopold's ecocentrism. And this right is not given by humans. Okay? Although it is humans that we create the laws, we create them for humans, for the enjoyment of humans and to protect humans. I mean, there you go. So I have 10 minutes. Let me just say that according to Aldo Leopold, we should learn, and in order to explain ecocentrism, we should learn and realize that mankind cannot and will never be able to control nature. And being under a climate emergency now, we have found out the rough way that we're not able to control nature. And once the cycle starts to break apart, we will ultimately end on self-destruction mode. Welcome to the 21st century. Now, Rachel Louise Carson in The Obligation to Endure is also very useful to consider in order to understand ecocentrism. And she described an idea of perfection that is formed by society. In her book, she focused on the balance and the cycle of nature. And she believed that since we live on the same planet, sharing with other living and non-living organisms, we don't really have the right to change the process of any natural appearance. Anthropocentric perception is widespread and is considered to be responsible for severe environmental crises, ranging from global warming, ozone depletion, and water scarcity, to the loss of biological diversity. The anthropocentric perception, for example, is responsible for deforestation. I'm also explaining anthropocentrism in practice. So deforestation, for example, contributes to global warming, where the trees logging means less absorption of carbon dioxide, thus leading to more greenhouse gases trapped in the atmosphere. A domino effect of such would lead to severe climate change, resulting in the extinction of various species due to habitat sabotage. As taken from an anthropocentric view, people cut down trees to build houses. or provide jobs. So there is a innate value in cutting down trees in this situation, according to anthropocentrism. And yes, therefore, destructive global outcomes emerge. The climate crisis is a climate emergency, and just like a pandemic, requires decisive action and doing things much differently. Not like the ways that the political community, the international political community, they're trying to play theater, and they're pretending to move positive legal action for tackling climate change. Okay, you can see in this comic, for example, a very illustrative example of what is happening the last 5 decades. So there you go. I don't have any more time. I will have to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found these ideas useful in understanding why is it that we are under a climate emergency and law is unable to really move positive action. Thank you very much.